Okay, now let's look at a different kind of division of the circle. First in degrees and then in radians again. This is still 0 degrees. It's still 360 degrees. The other ones we know, this is 90 degrees. This is 180 degrees. This is 270 degrees. But now, instead of dividing this 90-degree part of the circle in half to get the 45 degrees like we did in the first video, we're going to divide it into 3 pieces. And if I divide 90 degrees into 3 pieces, it's not hard to see that each of those is 30 degrees. So that would be 30 degrees and 60 degrees. Now we're just going to keep going by 30 degrees all the way around the circle. That's 120 degrees. That's 150 degrees. I'll probably add wrong here any moment. This is 210 degrees and 240 degrees, 270 degrees, 300 degrees, 330 degrees, and then 360 degrees. And remember, as always, these are positive. If I go the other direction, that would be minus 30, minus 60, minus 90, minus 120, and so on. That part's easy. Here's the part that becomes a little more difficult. What happens if I do that same division, but calculate and measure the angles in radians? Well, let's see what I get here. This is still 0 radians, still 2 pi. That's still pi over 2. This is still pi radians. This is still 3 pi over 2 radians. If I divide pi over 2 into 3 equal pieces, I'm going to get something like pi over 2. Can you read that? It looks okay. Divided by 3 is the same thing as pi over 2 times 1/3, which is pi over 6. That means this angle right here, dividing the pi over 2 into 3 equal pieces, is pi over 6. And then another pi over 6, but that would be 2 pi over 6. If I reduce that, I get pi over 3. Right? That's 2 pi over 6. If I reduce it, 2/6 is 1/3. That's pi over 3. Keep going. Here's a little bit more complicated. Pi over 2 plus an additional pi over 6. I'm going to let you add the fractions. This is 2 pi over 3. And this is 5 pi over 6. That's pi, which is 6 pi over 6, plus another pi over 6 is 7 pi over 6. Plus another pi over 6 makes 8 pi over 6, which I can reduce. 8 pi over 6 is 4 pi over 3. 9 pi over 6. 10 pi over 6, which I can reduce to 5 pi over 3. 11 pi over 6. And we get to 12 pi over 6, which is 2 pi. So take a minute to look at what it looks like when you go around the circle in increments of pi over 6. Pi over 6, because that is 1/3 of the way to pi over 3. I'm sorry, pi over 2. It's 1/3 of the way to pi over 2. Right there, that calculation. We got pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, which reduces. 3 pi over 6, 3/6 is 1/2. 4 pi over 6, it's 2 pi over 3, and so on.